Tonight I'm going to talk about 5 projects completed by our practice over the last few years. But actually, just to set all that in context and say a little bit about the UK context, I thought it might be useful to start the lecture just with a little preamble about really how I became a green architect and why that might be an important aspect in thinking about why we do it the way that we do. So, I was born in London in 1957. Wartime, just to put this in context, wartime rationing finished in 1955. England was shaking off post-war austerity, and my parents returned from the war to become one of the first generation of gentrifiers in inner London. We lived in a large house which was built in the first decade of Queen Victoria's reign, and typically, when I was young, houses were not fully heated. This one had cast iron radiators in the semi-basement and upper ground floor, but the 2 upper floors were completely unheated. And so my father got up every morning and stoked the boiler with coal, and our house had absolutely no insulation anywhere. It had single glazed windows, sliding sashes that leaked and rattled all over the place. And my father, he was architect and modernist, he removed all the chimneys, so at least we weren't leaking heat up of them. And actually our solution to feeling cold was just put on another jumper. That was the way we did it in those days. I'm making myself sound like 1,000 years old, but that's the way we did it. So in the 60s, we were living in buildings that were 100 years old, but they were very functional if you knew how to deal with them. We began using fuel that was much more modern in place of stuff that had fueled the Industrial Revolution. We were well fed with local produce, we operated locally, we didn't travel very much, and we took a very sort of pragmatic view to dealing with this old infrastructure. By the time I went to university, I began cycling, which has become a lifelong love, and it was a highly expedient form of transport in that very flat landscape of the Cambridge Fens. We were not well-off as students, so we became a vegetarian. But at the same time, what's really interesting is that my education was absolutely dominated by discussion of great modernist architects, and ecology was considered completely hippie, the preserve of odd people who dropped out from rural locations, and it was considered really, really marginal. So I actually first heard about ecology and ecological issues around the problem of acid rain, which Britain was dumping on Scandinavia and killing their forests because of our coal burning in power stations. So immediately you sense that that was actually a regional or a global issue and not just one confined to issues of British power. But as far as architecture went, the course consisted of a very short discussion about vernacular British architecture and a little bit about the arts and crafts tradition. But meanwhile, down the road in the research centre at Cambridge, there was going on a project which none of us knew anything about, and it was an absolutely foundational project into researching green buildings. It was called the Autarkic House Project. It didn't get built, but it was a long-term research project that went on in Cambridge to look at how you might make a house which is what we call now off-grid. This is a model of it. This cutting-edge work absolutely failed to filter down into the studio, and it's really surprising to me now how little credibility this work actually had. But the PhD students that worked on this project began to form their own practices, and it actually led to a whole range of really interesting spin-off work, which became very, very instrumental in our work, finally. And those were people like Robert and Brenda Vale, who went on to design their own autonomous house and Hockerton Housing Project. And of course, we were very interested in work with Walter Siegel, who had come from Germany as a refugee and started to live the suburban movement in the UK. Really, the one of the several influences for me were these buildings by a firm called Short, Ford and Partners that consisted of an architect, also actually trained at Cambridge. You can see the arts and crafts tradition in this work, and Brian Ford, who was a physicist, an environmental physicist, and they produced a series of really seminal buildings in the early 80s and early 90s, to early 90s. And what they did was based a lot of their thinking on the passive designs that came out of the Middle East. And their inspiration was things like this, the buildings which are built in the Iranian desert, where in cultures where there's a response to climate using organisation, fabric, and spatiality of buildings to temper the environment in a passive way. And they're made out of local materials and they're of the place. This to me was an incredible revelation at the time. I've never really heard of any architecture doing this before. It had been completely out of the discussions in my school. And for me, this kind of work represents a sort of knowledge which actually we're about to lose, of ways of doing which predate oil issues of oil buildings and are embedded in sort of custom and practice of ancient cultures. And so buildings like this one on the left are represented in cities like Yazd on the Iranian plateau, where the whole city's fabric is given its character by the wind towers that cool the buildings in the summer. A trip abroad is always a good thing. Coming to America was a kind of a moment of revelation for me that year, because stepping outside of your own patch and seeing it from a distance through the eyes of another culture is a very good way of assessing what's going on in your backyard. And I began to think about all the waste produced in our cultures, all the unsustainable farming practices, the way that our cultures are increasingly built on oil, moving at speed, consuming materials that they're not finite, etc., etc. And we returned to England after that journey in 1991, actually a completely different kind of architect than we were when we left. And it seemed to me that actually part of the issue was that architects were part of the problem, and that by over-technicising solutions or not looking at what was really going on, and not being interested in behaviour, people's behaviour, and the interface of people and the building fabric, and the abstraction that they tend to apply to a problem, meant that we were not offering solutions which have any resilience. So collectively, Jeremy and I began to formulate a different way of thinking about designing buildings and thinking about how you could use products which were recycled, buildings that could themselves be recycled, thinking of solutions that architects themselves didn't control, like self-build, and empowering people to make construction more accessible so that they could take control over it, making their own environment, using simple solutions that are not beyond the average person to be able to use, these kinds of things. And this quest manifested itself in a self-build project for us, Stock Orchard Street, where Jeremy and I decided to buy a site and build a kind of eco-house for ourselves. And in a way, this was a project which was research in practice. We now live there. This is also my office. So we live with our mistakes, and we have to learn from them and move forward. And it was the most massive research project, but it's in a way, I think, there's no looking back. There's, it's capital in the bank, and it's beginning to, bring dividends really. So this project, and you're looking here at the office part of the building from the railway line, it's sort of questioning issues around expertise and self-empowerment. It takes a passive environmental approach to the building, it making the fabric do all the work and creating its own aesthetic thereby. It uses components which were audited for their eco-criteria in a rather embryonic way, I must admit, because trying to find that information is very difficult at the time. It uses simple controls to operate So this is the site. It's at the end of the cul-de-sac. You can just see the tower of the building popping up there in the distance. This is a site plan. House is at the rear, shielded by the office, which flanks the railway line. And because it's in a tight urban site, all the issues around orientation to sun and breezes and even noise issues actually are slightly compromised. So actually the house's principal elevation faces southwest rather than south, but that's not so bad. You know, they're always dealing with that. And it sits on its own in a plot of land, which is also very much part of the scenario here. And when we designed this building, we have researched quite thoroughly what the kind of archetype of green building was. So in a way, this building contains all of those quite straightforward cliches about green building now. So heavily insulated north walls and natural ventilation through this stack effect out through that tower there. Lots of south glazing, but solar shading, green roof, rainwater recycling, solar panels for heating, water, and lots of recycled materials like gaming, concrete, and so forth. And as I said, selecting materials for their low-embodied energy. And that is what we built, and it got built rather slowly, but we did it. So this is looking at that front elevation, that southwest-facing elevation of the house. You can see the large area of the glazing. This piece of architecture is completely built out of made from steel, then it's timber floors and walls, with recycled newspaper insulation. The light quality inside, as a result of all this glazing, is really fantastic, and it's delightful to live in there actually. And you can see the kitchen here. The stack ventilation is provided by this tower, which doubles also as a library with a little room at the top where Jeremy writes his books. And you can see the green roof there, and on the right the larder, which is a naturally cooled masonry structure popping up through the roof, which is vented. This is it being built by the Irish builder. And then facing the railway line, in response to the acoustics and vibration of the trains, is this sandbag wall, which contains a lot of mass in order to counteract the noise from trains, which would make an office life unbearable. And the rest of the office is clad in this sort of duvet-style soft fabric, which can be removed after you get fed up with it or it wears out or whatever. So the idea is it can get unclipped. And there are opportunistic moments in this building as well, like the windows which are framed in these sleepers, which we found lying around on the site and thought, yeah, that would be a great way of actually framing up these things. So it does have a bit of the look of the last gunfight, the OK Quran. Also there, the office is held up on these gabion walls. This is part of an agenda about how do you build stuff really simply. Like you just get a cage, you fill it with rocks, and then you put the next one on, and off it goes. So, it's really trying to say, there are lots of ways of doing building which can be very simple to achieve. And in fact, our builders pretty much built these without any supervision or discussion with us, to the extent that they filtered out all the coloured rock and just made it great. Fine. The other thing that it uses is straw bales, and again, a bit sort of perhaps strange in an urban environment, but we were alerted to the straw bale by an eco-journalist friend of ours, and it seemed like a great thing to use in the walls, particularly because you could learn to build with it very easily again, and so we had a lot of friends around who helped us to do that. And to my knowledge, this is the first domestic project in the UK to get building regulations for a straw bale building. Here it is, it's on the face of the bedroom wing, which addresses the garden. It's clad up in rain screen cladding, and we've left a window there so you can actually see what's behind it, otherwise you wouldn't actually know. That's it in detail. And the other thing we've done here is make a productive garden where we grow our vegetables and we're pretty much veg technologies that involves things like willow weaving and the hurdles that make up this front fence, along with steelwork, is a kind of compatibility thing which we're very conscious of in trying to raise issues around the choices of materials and why you might favour one over another. And actually, in a way, using the surrealist technique, bringing opposites or different things together in order to make you think, really, what's going on.